those open up and you can have so on these big festival days where you've got the big competition, you get another 200 or so people sitting up there, but also you can use it for an event, even just small things.
Right. It's very different setup to our local cinema as well.
Yes.
I think I mentioned it probably.
Yeah, that was at Stanford.
Spent half my early
I mean,
teenage
yes,
life.
in Synagogue. Well, that would have been one of the Orthodox ones.
Yeah, I think so, because it had kind of raised platform, and it was all very.
And were the men and women separate?
Yeah, I think they were.
So then that's
I'm trying to remember that now. I'm testing my memories. But I think they might have been.
Yeah. So, Orthodox is very, very different.
But we had a good time with my mistress. I mean, I was saying to my son, I was like, oh, you're missing out.
Absolutely.
Because one of his friends, I did tell them about it. They live in Wimbledon. I thought this might be
Yes, you did mention the name. I mean, I might. Bruce probably know.
She was bringing to us walks in the room. She's a child psychologist. She was the counsellor to remember that language. She was the therapist for the children. She was amazing. Just they quite right.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm on brilliant meantime.
Thank you. Pull this down.
No, I don't need to.
Well, it doesn't, because I think it
Everybody
stays.
can hear
It
me.
stays up there anyway.
They don't need to.
Yeah, no, it does. As long as it's on, it stays
No,
up.
it isn't. If I had a gong, I would bang it. We're going to do something that Jewish people don't normally do, and that's start on time. Well, except for the rabbi and his services. Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see such a fabulous crowd here this evening. And we're also going to have a fabulous evening because we have two fabulous speakers. The reason for the title will be explained to you shortly, but initially, I would like to introduce you to Dee Anand on my far right, and to Lucy Gampell or Itkin, however you know her. So you do know her as Lucy Itkin, but she does work as Lucy Gampell. I'm very, very delighted that they've both been able to spare the time this evening. We're going to split it because Dee has to leave by 8 o'clock. So we're going to do a first half with him, coffee and break, and then the second half with Lucy. So I hope that's all right with you. Let me introduce Dee to you. He is a prominent British chartered forensic psychologist. And he's got over 25 years of experience in criminal justice, mental health, and academia. Throughout his career, his work has focused heavily on psychopathy, you try saying that, violent and sexual offending, and risk assessment. He has served as a special member of the Parole Board for England and Wales, and a parole commissioner in Northern Ireland. And acting as a special expert witness, he has produced over 1,000 expert risk assessment reports for both civil and criminal court cases across Europe and internationally. That's pretty good. So I'm sure we will welcome him in the usual way, and I shall hand over to Dee.
Actually, Ruth, I'm using that.
Okay, forget that. Lucy's going to start.
Sorry, we should have briefed Ruth a bit better. Welcome, everybody. I'm just going to do a very short, I think, sort of 5-10 minute intro, and then I will be handing over to Dee, who'll be doing the bulk of the first part of the evening. Because as you've heard, he's got to go. Apologies, Ruth, I should have made that clear to you. So People don't know me in my professional career very well, so I've been working in and around prisons since the late 1980s, when I was originally working in community arts. Sorry, has that gone off? Yeah. Yeah. I was asked to set up some arts projects in prisons, and I was instantly struck by the misrepresentation and demonisation of prisoners in the media, and how many of the men I met had grown up believing they were no good from a very, very young age. Years on, mainly through my work on the Parole Board, I now understand how behaviour is shaped by factors such as their early childhood experiences, traumatic life experiences, poor mental health and neurodiversity, all of which Dee will be talking to you more about. Early in the 1990s, when I started my career, it was something of a heyday within the prison reform movement. We'd had the Manchester riots, which I'm sure many people here will remember, the seminal Wolf Report, which looked at what had been the causes of that and what needed to be done differently. And we moved into an era of dynamic security, decency and rehabilitation being at the heart of imprisonment. In 1992, when I first started working for a charity to do with prisoners' children, the prison population in England and Wales stood at about 45,000 a day, and it fell to 42,000 under the Home Secretary Douglas Hurd at the time, who actually was a politician, a leading politician, who talked down the prison population. We don't get much of that now. It is currently around 87,300, so it has almost doubled in the time that I've been working in the system. And most of that is to do with sentences and minimum tariffs increasing significantly. In 2009, after 15 years as director of a national charity for children and families of prisoners called Action for Prisoners' Families, I was appointed to the Parole Board, and following that followed a rigorous and very competitive recruitment campaign. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the Parole Board, what is it that we do, that the Parole Board does? So the Parole Board is an independent body, statutory body, responsible for deciding on the release of all prisoners serving indeterminate sentences. And those are life sentences, and what has sometimes have become controversial, the sentence of imprisonment for public protection, known as the IPP. You'll, I'm sure, have read about the IPP sentences in the press. We also have responsibility for assessing whether to release people who are serving certain kinds of determinate sentences, but we won't go into all the nuances of sentencing. There are currently 8,500 prisoners within prison today serving some form of an indeterminate sentence. Some of those have never been released. Some of them have been released and recalled to prison. But they can only be released. These prisoners can only be released on the direction of the Parole Board. So that's on the direction of people like Dee and myself. We also have responsibility for assessing whether prior to release, life indeterminate sentence prisoners can be progressed from closed prison to open prison. And the big issue about that is that once they're in an open prison, they will start to go into the community on day release and then ultimately build up towards ultimate release. They might be going home on home leaves, overnight stays. So we have responsibility for assessing whether they are ready to progress to open conditions. And if we think they are, we make a recommendation to the Secretary of State. And it is the Secretary of State's decision whether or not to accept that. When we decide somebody meets the tests for release, that's a direction, and the Secretary of State, whether he or she likes it or not, cannot really overturn that decision. It's very difficult for them to do so, thankfully, in our opinion, I think we would say. I can talk more about the criteria. I'll do that later when Dee has gone. I think there are so many myths around about the Parole Board and what we do and you know, who we deal with. And contrary to public perception, prisoners do not choose to have their case considered by us. They don't say, we think we're ready for release, we're going to apply to the Parole Board for release. It is the Secretary of State, the Ministry of Justice, that refers all cases to us. They decide, based on the sentence that somebody has, when their case should come to us for review. So we are a cog in a very big criminal justice wheel. And it's not our role to further punish somebody. We are not looking at the sentence and saying, is this a just sentence? Is this person, have they done enough time? If they've been sent to us, that means that under the law, they have done enough time. They've done the time that they need to do to be assessed for release. And it's not our job to punish them any further or to make any judgment about that. And we have to carry out an objective and fair assessment of risk based on how they are now, not how they were 15, 20, 25 years ago when they committed these serious offences. However, again, contrary to popular belief, almost 90% of all prisoners are released automatically with absolutely no risk assessment whatsoever. They're released early as part of the, again, as part of the criminal justice system, and it has nothing to do with whether they're been of good behaviour or whether they have reduced their risk. Many of those get recalled to custody, and that's another large category of people that we deal with on the Parole Board. However, everybody that is released is subject to licence conditions and will be supervised by the probation service. I know we've got at least one former probation officer in the room here tonight. And they will be liable to recall if they break the terms of their licence or if their risk is deemed to be increasing. Another myth is that we are parole officers. I think that's an Americanization. We are not parole officers. We do not work with the prisoners either before the parole hearing or after it. We literally go in, do an assessment of risk at an oral hearing usually, and then walk away again, and we have nothing more to do with the prisoner. For the prisoners, they often find that very unfair, that we're making this huge judgment on them just based on a few hours of interview and the paperwork that we will have received. But I'll speak about more of that later. Just really to say that the numbers have increased enormously that we deal with on the Parole Board since I joined 16 years ago. The numbers of members have increased. I'm one of about 250 what are called independent members, which means that we come from a variety of backgrounds. I am not a lawyer. I've got no formal legal training. Some people might think that's very odd and wrong, but we have a lot of lawyers on the Parole Board, and then we have specialist members like Dee, who's a psychologist. We have specialist psychiatric members. We have formal judicial members. And in my time on the Parole Board, I have considered the release of well over 5,000 high-risk prisoners. I am pretty experienced at what I do, but as I say, I can talk about that more later. So before I hand over to Dee, I'm going to briefly introduce you to two people who you might have seen. I don't know if anybody here saw the documentary series, the Parole Board, any of the BBC TV documentary series. There's two of them. Two series, and we're going to focus on an episode in Series 2, Episode 2, Can Leopards Change Their Spots? And I'm just going to very briefly introduce you to the two people that feature in this. Jason is serving an IPP sentence, that's a sentence for indefinite imprisonment, for offences of robbery, burglary, and false imprisonment. Jeanette, who you'll also see, is serving a sentence for murder, and both of them have not been released before by the Parole Board, and both of them are post-tariff. That means they've served more than the judge decreed they had to spend in prison before they'd be eligible for release. So here is Jason.
I must have been 6 years old then. It was late at night. I was in my bed.
flavour of Jason, who you'll see a bit more of later. And this is Jeanette. We're going. That's okay. So I'm going to hand over now to Dee, and we'll come back to those two characters later on.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Fabulous, good stuff. Right, I'm just going to do some plugging in, and hopefully we shall have some slides on the screen for you. Bear with me. You know, I'm older than I think I am, so I can't actually read anything without my glasses. So I'm going to do. Just let me know if that is that all good. Fabulous, good stuff. Well, thank you very much, Lucy. And I have to say, it's a real honour and a privilege for me to be here today to speak to all of you. So I'm very grateful to Lucy for inviting me, but also speaking to the people online. So hello, invisible people online. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about forensic psychology and about the propensity that people might have for change, particularly when they've done really bad things. So that the criminals and the people who Lucy and I work with on a regular basis. One of the things that I think is clear is that the way that we get our messaging about criminals and people who have done bad things is largely from the media. If we're not working in that field, we largely get these messages from the media. And this is extremely controversial. What that does for me as a forensic psychologist, and I'm a forensic psychologist, which means essentially like a criminal psychologist, I'm not just focusing on somebody's well-being or the mental disorders that they might have. I'm concerned with how dangerous they might be and this concept of risk. And I'll be talking to you a little bit about what we mean by risk and what we as forensic psychologists mean by risk in a moment. But one of the things that's really crucial for us as a profession is that when we have the public who are getting all of their ideas largely from the media, and by the media I don't just mean, you know, the red top tabloids and, you know, and Jeremy Kyle on the television. I'm talking about movies and books and all sorts of fiction as well. When people are getting their ideas of criminality and people who do bad things, they tend to get this idea that people who do bad things are either evil or mad in some way. And that creates a huge pressure for forensic psychologists when we're in the room working with these people. So when I walk into a room and I'm sitting across the table from somebody to conduct a psychological assessment, I'm not really just in that room with me and that other person. I'm in the room with the expectations of the public. I'm in the room with the messaging from the wider media. And there is a huge amount of pressure within that room that I, as a practitioner, we as a profession have to divorce ourselves from, to be very clear that what we are working with and the person we are talking to, that it is that we are working with. I've worded that really clumsily. I should have been checking my notes. But my point is that we are assessing that individual based on the best evidence and the best research that is available to us at the time. So the question is, why does this messaging come across in the public and in the media in that way? You know, the media will have you believe that they bear a responsibility, that there is a public interest, and you hear this all the time, that there's a public interest to why a particular story is being covered. I would challenge that. I would say that certainly for the tabloid media, much of the coverage is titillation or the seeping of these poor ideas and poor social representations into modern culture, and we're seeing it all the time, particularly at the moment. When we think about what's happening with Southampton, the way that's being reported and the way that the messaging is coming through the media, it's problematic. What this does is creates real barriers for us as practitioners to try to understand why people do what they do, but also to create the conditions for change. And what happens then is these individuals, they get these labels. They might be diagnostic labels, and I'll talk about diagnostic labels like personality disorder or psychopathy and things like that a bit later on. But they get the labels of being evil or being crazy. And all of this is this cauldron of pressure. So we need to understand as practitioners what it is we're there to do and what we are there to assess, which is largely risk. Now, for forensic psychologists, when we think about risk, we think about what we call a tripartite model of risk. So certainly with the Parole Board and in the work that Lucy and I do, we're largely focusing on risk of dangerousness. And that's one strand of risk that we as psychologists are looking for. So how dangerous is this person? What are they going to do if they're released? What are they going to do if they don't have the help or the intervention that we want to give them? So risk of dangerousness is one of those strands that we're looking at. But as psychologists, we're also looking at risk of deteriorating mental health. And of course, how does that feed into our understanding of risk of dangerousness? And the third strand is the risk of harm to themselves or others. So we're looking at those three strands of risks as psychologists. And one of the interesting things about forensic psychology, which differentiates us from something like clinical psychology, is that we're really looking at the interplay between those three strands of risk. So risk of harm to self and others, risk of dangerousness, and risk of deteriorating mental health. So all of that points to this notion of recidivism and how likely someone is to commit a further crime or to cause harm to somebody else. Now, of course, these notions of risk come very much from the media. So when we think about what risk of harm we're talking about, we're thinking about the constructs of social harm. We're thinking from a sociological perspective, what does our society say is normal and acceptable? And those norms change over time. And how do we define what we consider to be acceptable and what we consider to be not harmful to others? And again, this changes all the time, and it's particularly sensitive at the moment. If we think about social media, and what the impact is of social media on changing our notions of normality and what we consider normal behaviour, normal sexual interests, normal interests in violent imagery. Some of those things would have been absolutely abhorrent and unthinkable just 15 or 20 years ago. And now the seeping of those notions and ideas into modern culture are normalising some of those things that we would have considered absolutely abhorrent a few years ago. So this ever-changing notion of what is risk and what is normal is something that we as psychologists have to be attuned to and very sensitive to. So yes, as I said, you know, the wider public kind of gets this notion that criminals, they're all psychos. You see this all the time in headlines in the red tops. You know, psycho killer has done this, or schizo whatever has done this. You know, all of these really sort of awful, you know, pejorative terms and labels that are given. And at the same time, psychologists are often kind of viewed as these sorts of rather, you know, soft touches, you know, these kind of like touchy-feely, woolly left-wing liberal types, and the truth is there's probably some truth in that, right? Okay, you know, I probably am a little bit like that. But one of the things that I think is really important is that when you've been working in this field as long as I have, and you do find yourself much more hardened to some of those things that might have hoodwinked you as a younger psychologist or a professional. And certainly when we're working with some of the cohort of people that I work with on a clinical level, so I'm talking about people who've got something called personality disorder, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, or psychopaths, so psychopathy as a concept, which is it's a bit controversial as a concept. But when we're working with people like that, part of their presentation, part of their personality presentation, is to be often very charming or to be very vulnerable, essentially to kind of draw people into their orbit and their purview so that you're much more sympathetic to them, so that you're much more favourable to them. So certainly when I was, I did my research on psychopathy in Broadmoor, and we had all the good ones there. And one of the things that I would do is I would never send any of my assistants or my trainees to working with any of the people that I was working with at Broadmoor to conduct an assessment. Partly because, largely because the people in Broadmoor were very, very disordered, but also sometimes very, very expert at being psychopaths. They were very, very skilled. I remember one time I was there and I was talking to this guy in Broadmoor, and I was chatting to him, and I was thinking, and we were getting on like a house on fire. We watched the same stuff on TV. We enjoyed the same comedies. We shared the same political views. We were having a good old natter, and this is when I was a young trainee. And I genuinely was, for a moment, I was sitting there and I was thinking to myself, I think I'm having a great time. I'd love to have a pint and we'll have this chat over a pint. And then you have to check yourself and say, no, hang on a minute, he's brutally raped and murdered his own aunt and several members of his family. I don't think I will go for a pint with this guy. And that's an example of quite how skilled some people can be. So it's very much a concentration on what the evidence tells us rather than the kind of perception of how these people might come across. We have to rely on the best evidence at all times. And of course, from I won't give you a kind of history of psychology, but certainly the evidence changes over time. I mean, a brief window there, in 1876, somebody called Lombroso, he believed that criminals were actually a different species, and that they were somewhere between a primitive human. They were just below a primitive human, and you could tell by the shape of their head whether they were more or less likely to commit a crime. Now, of course, we know that's the research moves on, and we've gone through various iterations of the best research at the time, and Freud in the mid 20th century, would have had a different idea. We as psychologists, we are concentrating on that best research and that best evidence to inform all of our assessments of risk and dangerousness. We're not interested in what the press might have you believe. So we're not interested in moral turpitude, and we are interested in what we know, what the evidence says about certain aspects of a presentation as a risk factor. So for a long time, for example, if we think about sex offenders, and one of the big underpinnings of a sex offender treatment program was that people had to admit their offence. They had to accept that they had committed a sex offence. But actually, what the research told us is that denial of a sex offence isn't actually a very potent risk factor. So the evidence has shifted, and that's just in the last kind of 10 or 15 years, really. The evidence shifts over time, so our sensitivities to particular factors has to shift over time as well. So we have to think about what it is that we're trying to change. A lot of the evidence and a lot of the research at the moment is looking at things like neurodiversity and ADHD and the autistic spectrum. The question, of course, is what element of a person's presentation do we really want to change? Many people who have a neurodiverse condition will tell you that although they don't necessarily want to be defined by the label, some of those traits are absolutely integral to who they are. So we don't want to change that person. We don't want to change who you are. But the question is, what elements of that presentation are risky? What elements of that presentation are detrimental or have influenced the decision-making that you've made to commit a series of offences? Those are the bits that we're really looking at and that we really want to change. So when we're conducting a risk assessment of dangerousness, one of the things that I'm often asked is, well, how likely is this person to commit a crime? Give me a percentage. I've been asked that in court when I've been giving evidence as an expert witness. What's the percentage chance that this person is going to commit a violent offence in the future or a sexual offence in the future? I think that's really unhelpful. If I was to say to you, well, the chances are 35%, how is that different from 38% or 37% or 33%? It's a meaningless statistic. So while we do get an actuarial value of risk, it's almost always based on previous behaviour, on historic factors, and they have the highest predictive acumen. But if you just focus on those actuarial measures, it doesn't really tell you very much about someone's propensity for change or their ability to change. So for us as psychologists, risk explanation, really understanding the nuance of where that risk lies, is far more important and interesting than actually having a numerical value. And if we focus on the nuance, then what we're doing there is we're kind of removing ourselves almost entirely from the way that the media presents risk and dangerousness. Because the media will have a very dichotomous view about that. They're very black and white. This person has done a bad thing, this person is evil. We mustn't ever think about that person ever again. It creates a real us and them, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on. Or certainly they'll think, all bad guys are psychopaths. Like I said, you see these headlines all the time. So the question for us as psychologists is, how malleable might that person be? And particularly when we're thinking about psychopathy and personality disorder, which traditionally have been labels that are immune to change. People have said for a long time, personality disorder was talked about as a diagnosis of exclusion because they said it was untreatable. And the same thing was said about psychopathy. So let's have a think about where some of those ideas come from. There's a neat little example here, and I'm going to ask for you to have a think about this. It's called the trolley test. So I'm going to give you a scenario. Okay, I'd like you to. It's a bit grim, so I hope you don't mind, but just go with me for the moment. So I want you to imagine that you're standing on a bridge, and you're looking over that bridge, and there's a train hurtling along on the tracks beneath you. And if the train carries on going, as it is, there are 5 people on that track, and the train is going to squish them all and kill them all. Okay? But you have a lever in front of you. If you pull that lever, that train is not going to carry on and kill those 5 people. It's going to go onto a different track, and there's 1 person on that track, and it will kill just 1 person. Hands up, have a think, but hands up if you'd pull that lever. You think you'd pull that lever. So if you don't pull it, if you do nothing, 5 people will be killed. If you pull it, it'll go onto a different track and 1 person will be killed. Hands up who'd pull the lever. Most of you would pull the lever. Would that be an easy decision? Hard decision? It depends who it is, but we don't know who the person is. They're completely strange. Do you know what? I had this exercise the other day, and someone said, if it was my family, I'd pull the lever. I wouldn't pull the lever, they said. I'm like, okay. So you don't know. They're complete strangers. Who would find that a hard decision or an easy decision? Let's go with easy. Who'd find it easy? A lot of you would find it easy. I'm just going to pick on you randomly. Why would you find it easy?
Because 1 is less than 5.
But okay, so it would be just a numbers thing. So it'd be an easy decision, yeah? Would you have to think about it? Would be emotion attached to it?
Well, if I knew who the person was on the bad track, on the 1, then I might change my mind.
Okay.
If I knew that person to be a particularly bad person.
Okay. But if you don't know anything about them. Oh, so happy to kill strangers, Simon. Is that right? Okay, well, that's fine. That's all right. Okay. See you after. Okay. I'm going to give you a slight tweak on this scenario now. Okay. So this time you're standing on the bridge. The train's going, it's going to squish the 5 people, but this time you're standing next to an enormous fat man, let's call him Bob, and he has to be enormous because he has to be big enough to stop a train. Okay? Now, strength isn't an issue. Let's just say that you're strong enough, you can pick this person up. The only way that you can stop this train, it's going to kill the 5 people, you can see it's going to do that, is if you pick poor old Bob up and you throw him over the bridge onto the tracks, and the train will kill Bob, squish him, but it will stop and it won't kill the 5 people. This time, how many of you would chuck poor old Bob off the bridge? We love Bob. This time it's Bob, but we don't know him. We've just bumped into him, but he's big enough to stop a train. Hands up if you'd chuck Bob off. It's the same. If it's a numbers game, like most of you who had your hands up said it's a numbers game. I'd pull it if it kills 1 person, and I don't know them, and I wouldn't kill the 5. It's the same situation. It's a numbers game. It's Bob.
Can I be certain that that's what would happen?
You can be certain that that's what would happen. You can be certain that if you chuck Bob off, that he will stop the train. So hands up. What was that? Sorry.
We wouldn't be big enough if we were the ones that jumped.
No, you can't jump off that. I do love the self-sacrifice, though. But no, it's Bob or nothing.
I think it would be a different degree of moral injury.
Sorry, say again?
I think it would be a different degree of personal moral injury.
A different degree of personal moral injuries.
Chuck somebody in front.
Okay.
Pulling a lever is much more. It's more separate.
Okay. So you would do nothing and let 5 people die.
Probably.
Right? Okay.
So it's a bit late, but maybe if people are talking from the...
I'll repeat everything.
It's just on the, on the screen,
okay,
they can't
right.
hear.
Okay. Well, so let's have a show of hands then. Let's have a show of hands. Hands up who chucked Bob off. So it's still a fair few of you, but fewer than before. Okay. So the interesting thing about this example, and the reason I'm putting it to you, is to talk about the possibility of change and how challenging it is to change some people, and what the barriers are for us as psychologists. Because this example was given to a group of violent psychopathic criminals and non-psychopathic criminals and non-psychopaths. And this time they were all wired up to brain scanners. And the really interesting thing about this experiment was that when these questions were put to the psychopathic group, they had almost the same spread of responses as you guys have all had. I'm not calling you all psychopaths, let's just be clear. But they had almost the same spread of challenge and discussion around whether or not they would pull the lever or chuck Bob off. And a very, very similar kind of split. But there was a fundamental difference. And that difference was, when all of us in the room here are having that discussion and we're deciding whether or not we'd pull the lever or chuck poor old Bob off, the amygdala, which is the kind of emotional centre of our brain, on the brain scanners was lit up like a Christmas tree. It was firing away because there was such an emotional component to the decision. And with the group of psychopaths, even though it was the same spread of responses, their amygdala was just flat. So what we know is that with a small cohort of some of the most extreme offenders that we work with, their brain is functioning in a very, very different way to the non-psychopathic group. And this is a small cohort. But that creates, again, a platform of really significant challenge for us as practitioners. If we're saying that these people can't change, then when they come to the Parole Board for Lucy and I to chat to, how do we know that what they're telling us isn't just what we want to hear? They're just playing to the crowd. And actually, the truth is, the assessment of their dangerousness and the potential for treatment of their risk is null. So we're faced with some real challenges when we're thinking about personality development, particularly extreme personality development and dangerousness and assessment of risk. And the problem is, of course, personality and dangerousness aren't always so closely linked. You know, there is not a direct relationship between the assessment of dangerousness and the assessment of personality. What we need to do, and this is the nuance that is missing from the wider mainstream media representation of risk and dangerousness, what we want to do is we're looking at all of the variables that influence that risk. Those are the things that when Lucy and I are making our assessments, we can really focus on. We know there are going to be biological, neurobiological, sociological, and social determinants and psychological determinants of risk. So how much of an impact has any of the work that they've been doing on trying to moderate their risk, how much of an impact has that truly made? And that's a crucial element in our assessment. So when we're focusing on those areas of grey, on that area of nuance, which is an area in which the entire profession of forensic psychology lives. We don't live in the black and the white, we live and operate in that area of grey. What we're doing, the only way that we can really make a reasonable assessment is we're looking at all aspects of that person's life. We're not just looking at what the most recent bad thing that they've done. We're looking across their history. So we're looking at what they've done in different contexts, not just that singular pathway to offending across their lifespan. We're looking not just at the antecedents to the index offence, so that's the offence for which they are in prison. We're not just looking at what led up to that index offence. We're looking at their whole lifespan of offending and what all of the antecedents have been leading up to that, as well as the precipitating factors to the actual index offence itself. We're making an assessment and a determination of kind of global functioning. So we're looking at somebody's resources. What have they got access to? Their intellectual functioning, their cognitive abilities. What kind of level of education have they got? And importantly for us as psychologists, what is driving them? What is their general motivation in life? What do they want out of life? Now, how are they managing their emotions, and particularly when their emotions are aroused, whether they're good arousal or whether they're bad arousal? You know, how are they managing that? How are they responding to and interacting with their own emotions? And what is their own sense of personal identity? What experience do they have of themselves? Is their identity stable over time? What kind of thinking style do they utilise when they're making decisions or trying to solve problems? What's their relationship history? What's their attachment style? And of course, we are looking at the more specific offence-focused stuff. We're looking at their criminogenic thinking. We're looking at what actually motivates them for that particular offence. And we're looking at what their experiences of their interaction with themselves and each other. You know, one of the things that we see with people who present with really extreme personality disorders, and particularly those personality disorders, I don't like that phrase, by the way, personality disorder. I don't like labels for even psychological labels. I'm not a big fan of them at all, but I'm going to say a little bit about that in a moment, about why they're important in some cases. But sometimes what we see with people who have those personality issues is that they can have what we call a hostile attribution. So they can have a really negative view of the world. Somebody with a really extreme antisocial personality disorder, we would call it a disocial personality disorder, they might have this hostile attribution. So they wake up in the morning and they think, as soon as I walk out this door, this world is full of, you know, nasty people. They're all out to get me. They're all out to cause me grief and problems. And so when you or I might be in a post office queue and somebody might barge past us or maybe jump in front of us, we might think, oh God, that's quite annoying, never mind, you know, I'm up next. Whereas what somebody who presents with a hostile attribution and an extreme of personality, what they might experience when that exact same thing happens, they might go, there you go, that's just proved it, the whole world is out there to get me. See what's happened? And they might respond to that emotionally in a completely different way, whereas you or I might be a little bit peeved or put off or mildly irritated if that happens. That person, their access to their emotional resources might be completely different. They might suddenly turn to anger, and it reinforces that negative, hostile worldview. So if that's the case, then how is it that we're going to, you know, how do we change? You know, if somebody is on that really kind of extreme end of personality or psychopathic dangerousness, how do we change? If we're stuck in these sort of rather old notions of what personality is, and we're stuck in this kind of older notion of what personality disorder is, and this idea that it has been hitherto untreatable, then that means that we can't really work with them, right? Well, I don't believe in that. I don't believe that at all. As a psychologist, I believe in change. That I believe people, even those who have done the worst possible things, can change. And I've seen it, not every time, but I've seen it happen. Now, what that means, though, is that they have to be ready and they have to want to change, and we have to develop our strategies for trying to find that window. And where psychology has moved to, and where we're kind of growing into now, is a really important stage for that, and that is our understanding of how our early experiences of trauma influence the way that we develop and our interactions later in life. So, while I think it's useful to have labels as a diagnosis in some cases, and I've been talking about personality disorder a little bit, but one of the things with personality disorder is you kind of have to have a label or a description of a slightly disordered personality in order to access some of the best treatments that are available. It's an irony, really, because in the prison service, some of the best available models of treatment are something called therapeutic communities, and there are only a couple of them around. They're not huge numbers. I'm sure Lucy will probably got the data for you later. And what a therapeutic community essentially is, it's a prison, but everything is therapeutic in it. So everything you do, every interaction is therapeutic. The other prisoners on the wing are challenging everything that you do all of the time. The whole focus of that community is to try to almost re-engineer aspects of your thinking so you're more pro-social in the way that you interact with each other. And it helps to give you a better insight. But again, as I say, they're few and far between, and just ascribing a label or a value to their risk or their presentation isn't so helpful, I don't think. I prefer something, and as psychologists, we prefer something called formulation. And essentially, formulation is really a question. It's basically saying, what's going on with this guy, right? That's basically what formulation is. And then, of course, our psychologists will have some fancy words for it. But actually, what we're really trying to work out is what's happening with this person? Why on earth have they got to this stage where they think that what they're doing is okay, or they think that what they're doing is the best way that they've got to achieve what they want to achieve? So if we focus on that, and we think about this early experience of trauma, it kind of tells us what we want to change. There's a really lovely model developed by a friend of mine called Lucy Johnston, who's absolutely brilliant, and I encourage you to look her up if you're interested in this. She's come up with a model called the Power Threat Meaning Framework. And what she says in this model, and this is where a lot of modern psychology is now going as a result of this, is that fundamentally we as practitioners, psychologists, mental health workers, whatever you want to call us, for a number of years, we've been doing everything wrong, right? Because one of the first things that we do when somebody comes to us with a problem is we say, right, so what's wrong with you? And then we expect somebody to tell us somehow what's wrong with them. But it's fundamentally wrong. If we just change that very first question, and instead of saying, what's wrong with you, we change that question and we say, what's happened to you? Then all of a sudden, the whole conversation is different. And what we're looking at then is we're looking at somebody's own personal experience of trauma. And when we talk about early trauma, we're not just talking about the obvious bits of trauma like abuse or whatever it might be, in childhood. But somebody's personal experience of having a traumatic background might be very personal to them and very different to you or I. So you can have two siblings, for example, who are growing up in the same house, same parents, going to the same school, ostensibly having the same set of early childhood experiences, and they can develop in very, very different ways. Because one of those siblings, my experience might be very different to my brother's experience. I might grow up with all of the same influences, but I might be growing up thinking, He's always had the best of everything. Everyone's always favoured him. You know, I've been exposed to all of the same privilege and opportunity and all of that, but my personal experience might be traumatic for me. And so understanding what has happened to somebody, what their experience is, if their early experiences, is really important. And early trauma in this model, it talks about trauma in all sorts of different ways. So Lucy talks in this model about, it talks about financial trauma, so growing up in a hardship, economic hardship. There can be racial trauma, if you're growing up in a global majority but minoritized group. There can be religious trauma. There can be all sorts of different traumas that somebody experiences, and our response to that, the power it exerts on us, and what sense we make, and our response to that defines how we might develop later in life and interact with the world around us and the people in that world around us. So I'm just going to finish with my last couple of slides now, and I just want to say something about, kind of come all the way back really to what I started talking about, and that is this understanding of what the role of society is. And I want to put a difficult concept to you. When the media, I'm going to talk about red-top tabloids really, when they're reporting crimes, and they are almost always reporting crimes that Lucy and I would be ultimately working on in our roles in the Parole Board. When they're using these pejorative terms like mad or bad or evil or psycho killer or whatever it might be, what they're doing is they're creating a sense of otherness. They're saying that all of us, we're all normal, and we all live in this circle here. And anyone who's done anything bad or committed a crime, they're mad or bad, they're evil or they're crazy. So they don't belong in our circle, they belong outside of our circle. We call that situating outside of normal agency. And what that does then is that says, well, hang on a minute, those people have a responsibility to society, to all of us. Now, what I would say is that there are so many problems with that as a concept. There should be no concept of otherness. There should be no situating outside of normal agency, because in fact, those people who are doing the bad things, they're still existing in our society. So the question really that we should be asking ourselves is, what are we doing as a society that creates conditions where those people are doing these terrible things? We should not be saying that they have a responsibility to society. We should be saying they are the responsibility of society. And we have to ask ourselves, how are we defining what we consider normal or acceptable? How are we choosing our leaders who are helping us to create those boundaries of normality in society? It's a difficult concept to accept some responsibility for that. But it's a question I think we should all be asking ourselves, because this notion of otherness is entirely unhelpful. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions.
I'm just very interested on how you and Lucy are performing a uniform task of parole. You must have guidelines, or don't you have guidelines? Do you have a legal criteria to work within? Because you have explained your approach,
Sure.
which is very interesting and very informative, but there are people all over the country who are coming before parole boards, and is there some uniformity of how it works?
Yes. So
maybe I can come back to that this afternoon, not this afternoon, the second part, if you don't mind, just because if there are specific questions that Dee needs to answer, because he's got to go shortly.
But what I would say is that we do have legal guidelines, and we apply something called the codified test for public protection, which is test criteria that all
There's a
individuals-
framework. There's a legal framework in which we work.
And I'm sure Lucy will be talking
Yeah.
about that a bit later on. So the answer is yes, we do have a legal framework for that.
Thank you, Dee. That was excellent. I didn't quite understand the difference between, you talked about 3 risks: risk of harm and risk of dangerousness.
Yeah. So
how are they different?
the risk of dangerousness is essentially, when we're looking at it, risk of recidivism. So the likelihood of them to reoffend in a way that is significant. So as opposed to, and I'm not minimising this, but as opposed to a shoplifting kind of offence or a lower level. So when we're looking at risk, we're looking at risk of harm to self or others, and risk of recidivism or risk of reoffending. That's what the dangerousness. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Caroline.
Thank you, both really interesting. I'm interested in whether there's any kind of feedback loop that enables you to, enables the Parole Board to identify whether and when your assessment of risk has been correct or when it's been wrong. So when you've made a false positive or when you've made a false negative. For instance, when it is the case that you have thought that somebody was safe to let out and it turned out that they weren't, is there a mechanism for that? And how does that work? And how does that enable you to update your models, basically, of risk assessment?
It's a really good question, and I'll answer it more in general terms, if I may, and then I'm sure Lucy would talk about the parole. One of the things that I say to my students, just because I'm really a kind of a depressing guy, is that when you enter this field of forensic psychology or criminal justice, part of the problem, part of the challenge, one of the things you have to really come to terms with, is you never have a measure of your success. You only ever have a measure of failure. Because you only know if the work that you're doing from a treatment perspective, you'll never know if it's being successful, right? You will know if somebody has reoffended because they're brought back to the criminal justice system, and that data you will get. So that's a measure of your failure. What you don't know is that the people who don't reoffend, who don't come back into your purview, they may very well be out there reoffending and just become a lot more skilled and not got caught, right? So you might think to yourself, "How fab! I don't have anybody who's come back to reoffend." Maybe you've just skilled them up and they're not getting caught anymore. So you only really have a measure of your failure in this job. You can never really be completely confident about a measure of your success.
I'll just add to that we have, so there is a mechanism. If somebody that we release within 3 years of our directing their release is charged with, not convicted, but is charged with a further serious offence. And what you have to remember is that we're not looking at the risk of general reoffending, we're looking at the risk of serious reoffending. So if they're charged with a further serious offence, it comes back to review, and I actually sit on the review committee that looks at that. Now, the good news is that it's less than 1% of the cases that we release over 3 years come back to haunt us in that way. That could mean that we're not releasing enough people, we're being very risk averse. It could mean that we're very good at our jobs in assessing risk, or as Dee says, that people just aren't being caught. What the review committee does is we look at the decision from 2 angles. We look at, was the decision that panel made the kind of decision that other panels would have made? Was it a justifiable or an understandable decision based on all the information that panel had at the time from what we can tell about it? So we have to gather that information as best we can, and then have they explained that decision properly in their decision letter, and then we grade it, and then it's all collated and there are lessons that are learnt and those get disseminated out to the members. So that's a kind of really, I think, does that answer your question, Caroline? Yeah. Okay, I'm just conscious that Dee's got to go in about 5 minutes, so we'll take a couple more. I know we've got
just a quick
lots
one,
of
thanks,
hands
that
up.
was really interesting. I just wanted to ask you about the amygdala research, and if anyone's looked at first offenders, whereas those who've done multiple ones, and whether there's any change in the amygdala response, whether it becomes desensitized, deconditioned, whatever.
I mean, that was very, very kind of, it's an audience-friendly example, really. So I use that, for this talk. In that particular type of research, when they're looking at psychopathy and criminal psychopathy, you would only really meet the criteria for that sort of label if you have committed a wide range of diverse offending. So it's a little difficult to kind of look at that with a one-time offender. You would be looking at somebody who's already got an established pattern of offending. So, yeah. This lady in the middle's had her hand up for a while, yeah.
I just want to ask you, obviously...
Oh, hold on 2 ticks. It's just for the people, if anybody's online streaming it, they can't hear. Yeah. So.
Okay. Hi. I was just listening to you speak about the media and how criminals are portrayed as mad and bad and evil. And how worried are you going forward with the power of social media, which literally just sends fear and whips up fear? I just think your job's going to just get so much more difficult as a forensic psychologist. But I was just interested because it's gone way beyond just what we read in the papers now.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. You know, I think I'm going to retire. But I think it's a real problem, because partly what happens with social media is, as you say, it's not accurate reporting on a crime. What it is the whipping up of an emotional response to something that can be kind of clips, that might not be the whole story, that provides no context, and there are so many problems with that. You know, I have a problem with labelling and psychological labels. You know, that's small fry compared to the problems that social media creates. I think for me, and I tried to touch on it very briefly in my talk, is that the issues with social media are not just around the kind of frenzy around and the mistruths and the myths of the reporting of a particular incident, but it's about the wider impact that's having on society and our perception of what is normal, what is acceptable. And you know, I'm sure people would have seen the Louis Theroux documentary on the manosphere. It's a terrifying documentary on Netflix. If you have time to watch it, I'd recommend it. But it's not easy viewing. And I think that the seeping of those really negative, antisocial, misogynistic in those terms, ideas into what we consider our normal social constructs is actually what is creating an environment for really more problematic and serious offending in the future. So I'm really, really worried about it. But hey, more work for me. So.
Yeah. Dee has to go because he's got. Do you want
one more? Let's take one more.
Okay.
Why not?
We've got so many hands up. Right.
In making your decision as to releasing someone, how do you factor in support in the community? Because clearly some individuals who are potentially dangerous can be safeguarded if they have adequate care in the community. And you haven't made any mention of that.
Can I pick that one up after the break? And is there any other question that's specific to Dee as a psychologist? Yes,
one more.
Shoshana.
Hello. Is there any use of MRIs on the brain? Are you seeing something that, you know, it might be, as they do for other types of problems?
Yeah, not so much, if I'm honest. So, for the purposes of research, sometimes those MRI scans are used. So, when there's a lot of research that's going on in Canada on psychopathy, and they've been doing a lot of work with MRI brain scanning of people who present with psychopathy. And one of the things that they found, which is really interesting, is that some of the grey matter in the prefrontal cortex is directly related to psychopathy. So the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that might regulate things like empathy and guilt. And there is a significant reduction in grey matter for those who present with psychopathy in the prefrontal cortex than those who don't present with psychopathy. And more interesting even than that is that you can actually tell the intensity and extent of psychopathy from the amount of deterioration in the grey matter. But the problem, of course, with focusing on that side of things is that one of the issues with that type of a model is you kind of go back to Lombroso with the wobbly head at the beginning, and it kind of says, well, how much of that can we really change? And of course there are arguments about neuroplasticity and all of that kind of stuff. But actually, if we focus too much on that rather than looking at the social, neuropsychological and other determinants that influence behaviour, what we're saying is we can't really change that person, so we'll just bin them off. or I believe, is that we can actually change. It's just elements of what that change means and how we work. So from an assessment and treatment perspective, not so much the MRI scans, but from a research perspective and informing what we do, absolutely a lot of that goes on.
There is just one thing, if I could add to that, though, is that we do sometimes ask for neuropsychiatric assessments of brain injury or of dementia. Which is becoming, particularly this very elderly, increasingly elderly prison population, then there, if we're trying to work out if somebody is going to understand their license conditions, are they going to be able to, conform if they are released, and there are concerns about their cognitive functioning, or they've reported that they suffered brain injury in adult, as a child or before the offence, and suddenly people think, well, maybe there's actually some neuropsychiatric process, reason for their behaviour, then it's very difficult, but we do sometimes go really guns out to try and get a neuropsychiatric assessment. But I've had a recent case recently where we spent a year trying to get the assessment for a man, because everybody said, we need to understand if he's got brain injury, blah, 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 and he just flatly refused to have any of the assessments done, and we've ended up at a total impasse, and so we couldn't, So, they have to consent, of course. You can't force any MRI or any treatment on anyone.
I have to say, in all my years at the Parole Board, there is nobody I've worked with who is more tenacious than Lucy in trying to get those.
I paid him to say that.
She's absolutely amazing. So, absolutely one of the best people there.
Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think that with the amount of interest and the questions, we could go on for a very long time, and then Lucy would only start at about 10 o'clock tonight, and that wouldn't be very good for anybody. So we do have to draw this to a close. Dee, I'm afraid we are very sorry that you've got to go. I'm sure it's very important, but we're very sorry, and we'd like to show you our appreciation once more. Thank you.
That's very kind. Thank you.
Can I just say that coffee, tea and cake is now served. We will have a break now. Part 2 is Lucy, and contrary to what the notice says, we are going to be going on. We won't finish at 8:30. We're supposed to finish at 9, but I have a feeling we may go on a bit longer. But let's come back in about 20 minutes.
If you need to leave, please do feel that you can leave. Thank you, Dee, that was just brilliant.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much. This is great police consultant. I had exactly the same pairs. I nearly wore them today. Exactly the same pairs. I know it's yours. We're good. microphone and it worked very well.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll put that back on.
For reminding always, microphone for
Yeah, for the speaker, so I'm used to that at
it's
conferences.
advantages to be Jewish. Yes, sometimes. But I thought somehow we have the text.
But I think most people did put their hand up in the end.
I didn't.
Now I'm going to have to work out how on earth I pick up from this. Okay, people could sit back down so that we can get started as soon as possible. Okay, if everyone could settle back down, please. I won't be giving you parole. Right. Thank you. So this next part, it can be as long or as short as we want. I mean, there is so much that I could say. I was hoping to show quite a bit more of the documentary, but time is running on. So I think what I'll do is I'll talk a bit more about some of the questions that were raised earlier in the Q&As about how we actually do our job, what it is we're looking at and listening to. I'll then hopefully show a bit more of the documentary if people are still with us and wanting that, but there just isn't time to show as much of the documentary as I would like. But if you have TV licenses, it's all on the iPlayer, so you can easily access it. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more then about the Parole Board and what we do. As Dee said, we work within a very strict legal framework. And we have to apply something called the Codified Public Protection Test, which basically means that we have to assess whether it remains necessary for the protection of the public for somebody to remain confined in prison. And that's the wording that we're asked to consider. And when we're doing that, we have to consider a whole lot of factors, and the most significant one of those is somehow we have to be satisfied that if we release them, there is no more than a minimal risk that they will go on to commit offence that would cause serious harm. Now that's hugely problematic when you're dealing with people who've committed the most serious offences imaginable, such as murder, serious sex offences from rape to any other kind of sexual offence, and serious violent offences, because, as we've been saying already, past behaviour is the best predictor of future behaviour. And we somehow have to be satisfied. And we're not just talking about in the next few weeks of release, in the next few months of release, but we're talking about at least, in my view, 3 years, because that's the review committee that we were talking about before. So I have my review committee hat on, and I'm thinking, gosh, is this going to come back to haunt me in the next 3 years? But we never really know, and I tend to say to prisoners in hearings, I say, look, none of us have a crystal ball, but we have to make this judgment to the best of our ability. So what do we make that judgment on? First of all, we have a dossier. We get sent, it's all now electronic, but the Ministry of Justice compiles in their wisdom a dossier which they send to us. And that has a whole lot of kind of essential documents in it, from the judge's sentencing remarks, which is really, really interesting. What was it the judge said about this man or woman? The judge will have heard all the evidence, assuming it was a trial, and if it wasn't a trial, they will have read the CPS paperwork and the defence information. But they have a pretty good handle on the case and why they've given the sentence that they've given. So we read the judge's sentencing remarks, we have their full list, their absolute full list of all their previous convictions, and that includes cautions and reprimands. So we can see when they first came before the police, which is often when they were 11 years old, and we can see those patterns of offending. Some of you might have seen the case I did in the first documentary series of the serial man that conned women. And, he had 42 years of conning women, and to me that seemed, well, it's very, very unlikely this man's going to change. So those patterns of behaviour, if we can see that somebody is frequently offending whilst they're already on sanctions, so they've been given a community sentence, so they carry on offending, they've been given a prison sentence, they're let out on licence, they carry on offending. Those are, big alarm bells for us. So we have all of that information. Then we have kind of current prison reports, current probation reports, a big document, it's at least 60 pages, produced by the Probation Service, which is the main risk assessment document. And then we'll have reports about things that they've done in the prison. They might put in some written submissions themselves to us. They might, their legal representative might put in submissions. So we have all of that, and then we'll look at that and we'll think, well, do we need anything else? Is there a psychological risk assessment in there? if they've spent time in hospital, psychiatric hospital, do we have all the psychiatric assessments we need? Do we need more? And we might very often, almost always, we'll ask for more reports at the first stage that a case comes to us. So it's a very forensic exercise that we undertake, and we make sure that before we actually have the hearing, if we're going to an oral hearing, we have the information that we need to make an effective and a fully informed and hopefully a fair decision. So last year, there were over 17,000 cases referred to the Parole Board, and of those, about 65% were not of the type that we've been talking about really today. They're determinate recalls. So these are prisoners on a fixed sentence who've been recalled for breaching their licence. Then there's about another sort of 18% that are on a determinate sentence. So a determinate sentence is when the judge says, you've got to fix, it's not a life sentence, you've got to serve 10 years, but you come out earlier than that. And there's a certain kind of sentence where they add on for more serious offences, and those people can come to us for an early release. And then we've got the lifers and the IPPs. So of those 17,000 cases, just about half of them got sent to an oral hearing, so we can decide on the papers. And usually if we decide on the papers, that means we're saying they're nowhere near suitable for release. If we think they may be, then we'll generally go to an oral hearing. And so an oral hearing has a panel. It can be anything from 1 to 3 people. I don't do single-member panels. I think I like to do panels with colleagues. Also, I prefer they're the more serious cases, the ones with more panel members. So I tend to do the higher, more serious cases. I chair nearly all my hearings, so I'm what's called the panel chair. We interview the prisoner. We will always interview somebody that's working with them in the prison, and we interview the community probation officer, the person that's going to be responsible for supervising them in the community, the person who's put together the support plan, the risk management plan that this person will have to adhere to if we do let them out. Very often we'll also be interviewing psychologists and psychiatrists if that's part of this person's profile and the reports that we have. So we have a lot of witnesses, and obviously then there's the prisoner. So we have a lot of witnesses that we tend to speak to, minimum of 3, and it can be anything up to 5 or 6, sometimes more. We also, I should have said, we quite often will have victim information in the dossier because the victims have a right to submit a personal statement to us. Within that, they can talk about the impact of the offending on them and what the impact would be if the prisoner is released. They can ask for licence conditions, so that's often an exclusion zone, non-contact. And now, in the last sort of year or so, they can actually ask to come and observe the oral hearing. Which is a little bit problematic. I won't go into the details, but we usually allow them, if they want to observe some, but not all of it, because we have to protect certain confidentialities for the prisoner. So we have all of that in the mix, and we go through quite a structured process of questioning. The documentary kind of matches it up a little bit. So when you watch the documentary, it kind of looks like we flip between asking the prisoner questions or the other professionals. We don't. We ask them in a very structured way. A lot of the professionals didn't want to be on camera, so again, you get a slightly skewed image from the documentary. So what is it we're looking for? We ask very, very probing questions. We ask very personal questions. I think a lot of us quite surprise ourselves at some of the questions we find ourselves asking, particularly of sex offenders. I won't go into those, certainly not within the sanctuary of a synagogue, but we don't hold back in the questions that we ask. And we're looking for insight. We're looking for what Dee was talking about. Do they understand what led them down the path that led them to committing such a serious offence? If they understand it, what were those factors and what have they done to address those factors? So a lot of people will say, oh, well, you know, if I hadn't been drunk, I wouldn't have done the crime. Or if I wasn't on drugs, I wouldn't have, stabbed him. I wouldn't have robbed him. It's all to do with my addiction. It's not to do with your addiction. That's the final kind of chink in it. The question for us is, well, what led you to that addiction? Why is it that you're using drugs, you're using alcohol to the extent that you are unable to function and you commit such a serious offence? And, we may hear a bit more from Jeanette in particular talking about alcohol and what a problem alcohol was for her. But she used alcohol to mask all the trauma, all the sadness that she'd experienced in her life. And other people use drugs and other people self-harm. And, so we're looking at, do they understand that, and how have they addressed it? And obviously, if they are one of the few prisoners that have managed to get to a therapeutic community, then there's a good chance that they will have really, really drilled down into all of that and hopefully come out the other side a better person. But the first thing is that people have to be ready to go through that therapy, and it's not easy to go through. And the second thing is they have to be able to access it, and that's also, not easy within a very overcrowded prison estate. So, we're looking at that. We're looking at, is there evidence within the prison that they are applying that understanding and those skills? You'll all know from the papers, and it's no secret, prisons are awash with drugs. Absolutely awash with drugs. It's scandalous. And I do a lot of European work, and my European colleagues cannot understand why it is the English prison system is so awash with drugs. And it's particularly spice, which is a synthetic cannabis, which is incredibly dangerous. And along with that comes a lot of violence in prison. So we're looking at, is this person avoiding drug use? Are they avoiding violence in prison? If they do get into scraps in prison, how serious are they? We have rafts, usually often of intelligence, security information, which is often malicious, but telling us that the prisoner's up to no good, that he's dealing drugs, or he's bringing in illicit contraband into the prison. And the prisoners get really het up about this because most of it's unproven, untested, and they often don't know about it until the day before the oral hearing when they get given their dossier. So, we have to kind of grapple with all of this. We have to consider allegations, whether or not they're founded or not. So, it's a complex process that we go through. Some people, of course, are maintaining their innocence, and they have every right to do so. And as we all know, there are miscarriages of justice. I would say in my 16 years on the Parole Board, I've only come across one or two people where I think they probably are genuinely wrongly convicted. But even where they are, we can't, that's not our job. We are not a court of appeal. We have to do our job based on the fact that they've been convicted. So that doesn't necessarily mean that we won't release somebody, but it does make the risk assessment that bit harder because you don't necessarily know what's changed for them, but you can unpick lifestyle. So you'll find, for example, quite often sex offenders, as Dee was saying, they will be in denial, or they will maintain their innocence. Sometimes they'll accept elements of it, and they might say it was consensual when, clearly the courts found that it wasn't consensual. With children, people say some things that most of us would find deeply shocking about, a child, being sexualized or coming onto them, and So they kind of accept it they skirt around accepting. So you can probe into attitudes, you can probe into lifestyle. If you know that they're drinking, you can ask some questions about all of that and just see whether they've got any understanding of what needs to be different if we're going to release them. Then comes the whole thorny issue that you raised about support. What is going to happen? And what we're looking at is manageability of risk, because as I've said, we can't have a crystal ball. We're never ever going to be fully sure that that somebody before us is never ever going to offend again. So what we're looking at is that risk manageable? Will there be warning signs? Do the professionals, the probation and other professionals working with them, understand what it is that they've got to watch out for? And that depends on the person being open and honest and engaging with the professionals. So if we have a prisoner before us who is very antagonistic towards probation, towards authority figures, towards prison staff, we're not going to have much confidence that they're going to be willing to comply with their license, that they're going to be open and honest. We then look at support networks. Do they have family? And if they have family, are those family protective? They may be supportive, but we make a distinction between supportive and protective because they're not the same thing. Are they going to be living in the area where their family are? Are they going to be living in an area, because sometimes the victims might not want them back in a certain area, or they may want to move to a different area to have a fresh start. We often hear prisoners tell us that they want a fresh start. They've kind of been inside so long, they've got no attachment to where they committed the offence, and they want to kind of start over again, and they think it'll be easier somewhere else. But what we're often faced with is that we know that if we release them, they'll often go to a probation hostel, it's called an approved premise. When I was first doing lifer cases on the Parole Board about 14 years ago, usually if they went to an approved premise as a lifer who'd been in prison, let's say, for 15 or 20 years, they would go there for a minimum of 6 months on release, often a year. Now we're lucky if they get 12 weeks because of the sheer pressure on places. And then it's almost so often that we don't know what next. The best that we're often told is they'll go into emergency local authority accommodation that's reserved for offenders, people who've come out of prison, and they'll get another 84 days there. But they're going to be with other bad eggs, to put it bluntly. And we just don't have social housing, and we don't have the desire, this is again what Dee was talking about, to have ex-offenders or people coming out of prison living in the house next door to us. People don't want that. We're very unforgiving, and therefore it's incredibly hard. And then we wonder, why is it that people slip back into their former chaotic lifestyle? They go back to the crack dens or whatever, but that's the only place that they can get a roof over their head. Or they might go back, they might even shoplift or something in order to go back into prison, because that's what they know, and at least they get a meal, they get food and things. So it's really difficult, but we absolutely do look at support network, and we look at support from voluntary sector organisations that play a really key role. And some people will have found something in prison to motivate them. I told you that I started my career in the arts. And, some people will be lucky. They'll have discovered they've got an aptitude for music or for fine art or for embroidery. Many of you might have come across a charity called Fine Cell that produced the most exquisite tapestry, kind of embroidered cushions and things, done by prisoners, male prisoners in the main, in their cells, and they sell for they a fortune. But these are few and far between. Somebody might find they've got an aptitude for sport, they might have gained a qualification and they've got a job on release. But so that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the whole package when we decide whether or not we can release somebody. And if somebody is recalled, that's not necessarily a bad thing for us. That may well mean that the risk management plan has worked, because we're looking at, will they be recalled? Will the risk management plan kick in before they go on to commit a further serious offence? Now, we're recalling far, far too many people to prison. The recall population is just through the roof. It's doubled in the last 10 years. But that's because the probation service are on their knees as well. The whole criminal justice system is on its knees. But from our point of view, as Parole Board members, the recall of somebody that we've released is sad and it's regrettable, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I sometimes feel that we release people. I feel quite often I'm releasing somebody with a bit of a heavy heart, because I know that there's a very high chance they'll get recalled, not because they've reoffended, but because they just won't get the support and the services they need, and it will just be too tough. We're sending people to prison for so much longer now, so people are coming out after 20, 30 years inside, and some of them aren't even going to make it to open prison. In the past, everybody would have, who was serving a long sentence would have gone to an open prison, but increasingly now, for various reasons, that's not the case. And if we look at Jeanette, if we have time to look a bit more at Jeanette, what happened to Jeanette was that before the hearing I did, so I did her hearing in 2024, her previous hearing in 2022, she'd done everything she could. She really worked hard on herself. She spent 4 years in a therapeutic community, really kind of unpicking all this childhood trauma that you very briefly heard her talking about at the beginning. And the panel unanimously, with all the witnesses, recommended that she should go to open prison. And the Secretary of State at the time had decided that none of our recommendations, basically, virtually none of them, were going to be accepted by him. And she got rejected. So she therefore had to stay in the closed prison. Now, that's not necessarily our problem. And it enabled her to show that she could cope with a very major setback. You saw the budgie, I think, at the little clip. That was when she got given the budgie because they wanted to give her something to give her hope. But we're then faced 2 years on with somebody who was already assessed by a previous panel as being suitable. We might have taken a different decision, but we felt that that was the right decision at the time anyway. She hadn't done anything wrong in those 2 years. In fact, she'd done everything right. So we're then faced with, do we make another recommendation for open conditions in the knowledge that the Secretary of State might say no again? It was a different Secretary of State, things were a little bit different, but there's still a risk. Or do we think that the risk is manageable for her to be released? And that was the big dilemma that we had to kind of work through. Can I just ask for a show of hands how many people saw that episode? How many people? Oh, it's actually quite a lot of you. So I'm not sure whether, would you like me to show a bit more of it? Yeah. Okay, all right, I shall find a bit that is going to be, obviously quite a few people did see it, so spoiler alert, those of you that saw it, so I've got to get rid of this now. While I'm just getting it up, does anybody have any questions at the moment that they'd like to ask me?
I don't need a microphone, but Lucy, can you just talk about 1 or 2 of the cases that you've mentioned to the past, where...
Sorry, Marianne, I think you will need the mic, because not only can I not hear you brilliantly, but people online won't be able to hear you.
Are you able just to talk about 1 or 2 of the cases that were really controversial, that hit the headlines? Are you allowed to?
I'm allowed to.
Names that people might be familiar with.
I'm assuming you're probably referring to War Boys is one of them. So War Boys, the London black cab driver, where the Parole Board directed release, and there was a huge backlash. Now, the first thing I'm going to say about War Boys, people may not like this, is that there is absolutely no evidence that that was a wrong decision, because it was an unpopular decision, but there's nothing to say it was a wrong decision because he never came out, so we don't know. But it was a very sound decision based on the evidence that the panel had at the time. It was a very expert panel. They had very expert witnesses. They had two or even, I think, 3 psychologist witnesses. And they did their job based on the dossier that had been given to them by the Secretary of State. So, I stand by the panel that made that decision. Obviously, we all know what happened. It got blown up, and our chairman had to resign because he wanted to protect the panel, and he took the flak. A lot has changed since then, and some of it, I will say, some of that change is for the best. So a lot of the change was about transparency, that nobody really understood how it was that we make our decisions. So things like the documentary series has come out of that, victims being more involved. A big change was that we now have to consider allegations, because one of the things that came up with War Boys was that he got convicted of specimen offences, and there were a whole lot of other victims, including, I don't know if everybody knows this, of course, Carrie Johnson. And the reason that case really got the media furore is because of Carrie Johnson, and she's a media-savvy person, and she was I think it was before she was actually married to Boris, but she was with Boris. And so she was able to whip it all up. Yeah, that's, it was... But, you know, as I say, the transparency has been very good. We now can give victims a summary. Victims are now able to come to hearings. Something called the reconsideration process came into being, which meant that the Secretary of State can ask for our decisions to be looked at again, but only on the grounds that they are procedurally procedurally wrong, or we've made a factual error. So not just because it's not popular. The irony is that prisoners have also got the same right to have a decision reconsidered. And in the years since then, the 8 or so years since we've had the reconsideration mechanism, it's nearly all prisoners that bring cases. Some of them are successful, some are not. Most the outcome ends up the same. But the Secretary of State can bring very few cases for reconsideration. So yeah, does that... so anyway, I'm going to show you a little bit more of Jeanette. Just bear with me. It's not easy because it chops and changes between the two. So I have to kind of... Here we go.
What are you darling? I've been in prison altogether for... It's just shameful. It's really shameful to talk about, because it's shameful to think that I did that. Who does that?
I'm Lucy Gampell. I'm an independent member of the Parole Board, and I'm chairing Ms Hutchinson's hearing. Ms Hutchinson is serving a life sentence for murder with a 13-year minimum tariff. This
because Dr. Omani, by the way, is a psychologist, member of the Parole Board. Some psychologists are doctors, not medical doctors. It's the level of, it's the kind of psychology degree that they have. And he's a psychologist member. Oh, sorry, let's go back to... Oh, what's happened to the sound?
I want to focus on
So you're beginning to get a picture of Jeanette. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask at this point about her or about... I know you haven't heard much of the evidence. I can show a bit more. Yes. Hi, Anne. Oh, sorry, just wait for the mic. Run around, Simon, get your exercise.
So she has a child who would be a young woman now, and does that play a part in your considerations that whether she's had a relationship with her child while she's been in prison? I mean, that must be incredibly difficult for the child.
Absolutely, and I mean, that was a very big part of the hearing, because I think it's the next bit I was thinking of playing. She's maintained contact with the child, her daughter, throughout her sentence. I mean, she got a 13-year tariff, which by today's murder tariffs is very small. The child was brought up by her father, the child's father and grandfather, and has kept contact with her. And there had been times over the sentence where it was felt that it was destabilizing for both of them, that she was taking on board all her daughter's problems. And, you know, daughter, it's not going to be easy for any child. That's my previous charity, was all to do with children and families in prison. It's not easy for a child having a parent in prison, let alone having a murderer in prison. Murder as a mum. So anyway, yeah, so it's been a very big factor, but the daughter's very supportive of her, and they seem to have a very healthy, not overly dependent relationship, because sometimes we're worried that prisoners are overly dependent on a family member or on a relationship, and they kind of put all their eggs in one basket, and you know what's going to happen if that goes wrong. So yeah, that gets probed a lot, and I think it's in the next bit I was going to show, which I can go on to. But any other questions at this point? You got to wait for that, Eran. You got to wait. It's 9 o'clock. Do you want me to show? I was going to show about another 7-8 minutes about her. Yeah. Which would include our discussion, not the decision, but the discussion.
A child, I know this is going to sound really silly.
I'll just put it about 10 seconds, sorry. Right, so we also heard, I will just say that we heard evidence, we had reports and detailed evidence from a forensic psychologist who'd assessed her and done a report. We had lots of old previous psychological risk assessments, and obviously we had the prison community offender, the person in the community, the probation officer in the community who didn't want to go on camera. So we obviously were asking a lot about the release plan, which was all about her going back to Hull, where she's from, but there was seemed to be, well, it's actually, no, sorry, she wasn't originally going there because there's no female hostel, so she was going to be released to Birmingham, where there's a specialist female hostel, which is kind of part of a building that's got all holistic services for women offenders and women with difficulties. And there was sort of a gradual return, phased return planned for her to go back to Hull, where the daughter was. So we were faced with, you know, do we go with that, or do we make another recommendation for her to go to an open prison? So for those who haven't seen it, who would release Miss Hutchinson? Oh, gosh. Anybody not up for releasing Miss Hutchinson? Don't count you, Simon. You know the outcome. Would anybody like to say why? Would anybody like to share their view as to why they think? You need a microphone, so Simon, you need to get on the before I tell you what we decided. Eran, what did you put your hand up for releasing her, or are you on the fence? Because you asked me what we did.
Internal optimist.
You're an internal optimist.
Internal optimist, and I want to believe that she can change. You
Okay.
know? But I mean, from what I've seen, which is absolutely not representative of the entire discussion, I'm sure, it sounds like there is a chance.
The documentary does do her justice, and it does the process justice. I wouldn't be part of it if I felt it was just kind of whitewashing. So we did release her. We did direct her release. The good news is that she hasn't reoffended. The sad news is that she got recalled. And I found out about it by chance because I was recalled means that she was brought back. She's back in prison. So I found out about it. You see, we don't normally, as we were saying earlier, we don't normally find out if somebody's just recalled. We only find out if they've been charged with a further serious offence. I was back at Send Prison doing something else there, and Mr. Fitzpatrick, who you saw on there, I said, oh, have you any news about how Jeanette's doing? Because you get quite invested in some of the cases, and particularly this one with the documentary and everything. And he said, oh, yeah, I'm so disappointed. I'm so shocked she's been recalled. And he said to me, he said, I would have put my life on her making it out there. And basically, she kind of reverted, not quite to the 24-year-old that she was when she came in, but in some of her thinking, she reverted back to that kind of wanting to party a little bit. She went not back to alcohol, but interestingly and surprisingly for us, she went back into drugs. And then there was a bit of kind of sexual kind of stuff going on. And because I heard that she'd gone back in, and I was kind of really intrigued by it. Both Brendan, the psychologist, and myself asked if it was agreed that we could go back on the panel. So we then did her next hearing, which was earlier, towards the end of last year. We did her next hearing to consider whether we give her another chance at release or whether we take the safer option this time and suggest she goes through open conditions. And because she unravelled so quickly, and probation tried really, really, really hard, they put in lots of measures. Her daughter was trying to support her. They moved her at one point. She went from Birmingham back to Hull. They then kind of thought, we've got to get her away from Hull and away from a particular negative male. They put her down, they sent her to Bristol, because that's the women's hostel there. But it just didn't work out, and so she was recalled. And we did, second time around, feel that she needs the more gradual progression through open. There's a very good open prison in York, which meant that she could sort of begin to build the relationships back in Hull, and we felt maybe next time around she could be released directly to Hull. So I don't know how she's doing. I hope she's doing all right. So it was sad. Yeah, Simon, can you bring the mic over? It's not just for the sound, it's for anybody that might be on the live stream.
So, when she was recalled, does that mean that the probation service was monitoring her and she was slipping up?
Yeah.
Or did she actually do something to actively get...
No, so it's the probation service that activate recall, even if someone's rearrested or charged. It's the probation service that actually have to do the recall. That's part of their statutory role. So her community offender manager was getting increasingly concerned about this very chaotic and increasingly risky behaviour because, you know, she was putting herself at risk, and in putting herself at risk, she was therefore putting others at risk. She wasn't violent, she didn't, you know, assault anybody, but she was getting to the point where it could have happened. So they recalled her, and yeah, then she has to go through the whole parole process, which takes a long time to go through again. Sorry, Simon, can you bring the microphone?
Just what was her original offence?
Murder.
I know, but under what circumstances?
Oh, okay. So that's what. So basically, she was talking about. She murdered a man who she was in a very bad circle of associates. They all would drink too much. There was quite a lot of violence. This man lived next door to her. Her little girl had gone next door while she was in the bath, and they hadn't let her in, and she just blew it. It was totally irrational, but she was very, very drunk, and she went round, and as she described, she and others attacked this man to the extent that she ended up stamping on his head, you know, and he died of his injuries. A very, very, very violent attack, very violent, that she doesn't shy away from, as you hear her say, you know. She doesn't shy away from it, whereas I didn't get the chance to show you about Jason, but the difference with Jason is that he takes virtually no responsibility for his extremely violent offending and repeat offending, and it's all the system's fault, it's everybody else's fault, but it's not his fault, and he doesn't even think he's a violent man, even though he tied up an 81-year-old man and put him in a cupboard while he was committing burglary of his house as part of the index offence. Then he did a runner he was having a hearing in an open prison, so he was doing well. Parole Board had moved him to open. He was in open prison. He was, they did a parole hearing for him. He hadn't had any overnight stays. He'd only been going out on day release. And so one of the powers we have is sometimes we adjourn. We say, well, you know, you're on the right track, but we don't want to give you a knockback because say no, because then you'll have to wait 18 months for your next hearing. We'll come back in 4 months, 6 months' time, but we just want you to have a bit more testing. So that's what the Parole Board panel said to him. And not the one on the documentary, the one a few years prior to that. So what does he do? He says, well, I've done 10 years. I've done a year more than I was meant to do. I've done 10 years. I've had enough. I'm going. So he does a runner from open conditions and then goes and commits a whole series of very, very serious further burglary and robbery offences. But he still doesn't take responsibility, so he doesn't get released, and he's very unhappy about it. But you can watch that. Yes, another question. So that's what we're saying about insight and taking responsibility that we're looking for.
Yeah, when you asked the question, would you release her? I mean, one of the things I noticed was she was doing a lot of crying. Yeah. She was very emotional indeed, and I wondered how fragile she was, and whether that might be an indicator to how she might cope outside.
Yeah, it was a very interesting point that, you're absolutely right, and it was so noticeable with her, obviously, you can see throughout the hearing, but actually what she talked about, because she's very upfront about it, she talked about the fact that her letting her emotions out and crying is a good thing, because in the past she didn't. She bottled it all up, turned to alcohol to deal with it. Having done the 4 years in the TC, she now feels able to show her emotion. And she wasn't a wreck. She was crying, but she was still very eloquent and very able to think about what she was telling us. Whereas sometimes, and she wasn't being emotionally unstable in the prison. So, you know, when she got the knockback, when she got told that the Secretary of State... So the other problem with the Secretary of State making their negative decisions, as they were doing at that time, was that they were taking months over it. You know, we, under law... You heard me say to her, you will get our decision within 14 days. If we don't send our decision out within 14 days, we get wrapped over the knuckles. That's within the law, that the rules of the Parole Board, we have to do that. That means I have to draft it as the chair, and a decision like hers will take me over a day to write, and then my panel members have to look at it and add their 2 pennies. Secretary of State, when they get the recommendation for open, can take as long as they want to make their decision, and the Secretary of State at the time was taking 6 to 8 months. So she sat there for 8 months in the closed prison, waiting to find out. And, you know, we have her and others talking to us about, they sat there with their bags packed. Now, I'd been doing Parole Board work at that point for 13 years, I think. And in all those 13 years, I had never heard of a rejection from open. And I think statistically, 98% of our recommendations were accepted and 2% were refused. Under that particular Secretary of State, it went to 87% rejection rate. Anybody know who it was? I'm sure some of you. Sanji, go for it. Yeah, it was the delightful Dominic Raab. And he made no bones about it. He said, I'm just, you know, I don't think any murderers, any child abusers should ever go to open prison. And he actually tried to change the law. There was a bill that went through Parliament just before the last election that thankfully, thank goodness for the House of Lords, got changed, got watered down. But he wanted to have the right to absolutely overturn our decisions. And he said, with no basis of evidence, he would overturn over 60% of our decisions just because, you know, he doesn't want people, you know, he didn't want people that the public wouldn't want to be released, so.
It just occurs to me that their problems must be so great, particularly after doing a long period in prison, and society is so awful outside in terms of finding accommodation, jobs, family issues, etc. It must be amazing that anyone manages to cope. I mean, could you give us any indication of how many people who are let out on parole are successful? Is it the majority? I tried to get those statistics for you today, and I was told that we don't have the statistics of the number of people that we release get recalled. So unfortunately, I can't. All I can tell you is that the serious further offences is very small. That's what I was saying. It's less than 1% of people we release commit a further serious offence. But we only release about 20% of those nearly 18,000 that come to us. We release a lot more from the oral hearings. It's nearly 50%. But it's soul destroying. That's what I was saying to you, that sometimes, I mean, Simon will know, my husband, you know, he'll know that I'll come home and I'll quite often be quite sad because I feel that we're releasing people to fail because they meet our test, you know, and it was really difficult with Jeanette because our heart was really, part of our hearts were telling us, you know, she should go through open conditions to have the best chance of success. And at her previous hearing, she felt that, and she didn't even ask for open prison. She knew that, for release. She knew that she should probably go through open prison. But the thought of getting a further rejection was too much for her at the time, and she asked for release. That's not our problem. But we felt, from a risk point of view, she met our test for release. And that's, you know, we go by the rules that we're given, and our rules on open kept changing in the last 4 years. And we used to weigh up a benefit. It was literally called the benefit test, and you would say, is there a benefit in this person going to open conditions? And that's no longer our test. We only consider open now if they don't meet the criteria for release. And we felt, on balance, that she met the criteria for release. So I'm really aware that it's nearly 9:30 now. I can answer questions till midnight, but I'm sure that some people probably want to go home. Robert, Sam, can you bring Robert the mic, and then also, sorry. Well, okay, go there first, and then Robert Beaver, and then sorry, I've forgotten Cara's husband. Yeah, he's got it. Robert, we'll come to you in a minute. We've got one here.
I'll start. So let's maybe talk about the elephant in the room, the drugs.
Yeah.
You said the prison services are awash with drugs. It's not surprising that prisoners sitting around there bored in prison go to drugs to kill the time.
Yeah.
and then she's a prime example of drugs caused her to return back to prison. So a couple questions. What's the prison doing to stop the drugs from coming in? But are there programs, are there just say no programs to teach them to deal with that so when they get released they don't fall into that?
So every single prison in the country has a drug treatment team, a substance misuse team in the prison, all of them. And, you know, they offer a range of services. Jeanette had used drugs in prison. It became her go-to instead of alcohol, but she hadn't used drugs for, I think it was 8 years. She'd been clean for it was either 6 or 8 years by the time of the oral hearing. She hadn't used alcohol and she hadn't used drugs. So she'd show, even though they were in the prison, she'd shown that she was managing without them. The programs that are on offer vary. They are nothing like as intense. None of the programs in prison are anything like as intense as they were when I came to the Parole Board and when people like Neil were a probation officer. I mean, it's just a sad fact of underfunding, under-resourcing. So they used to do the 12-step program, the Narcotics Anonymous, the 12-step program. That's no longer available. They do kind of shorter, less intense courses. There are therapeutic drug treatment places, but drugs are coming in. They're coming in through staff, a lot of corrupt staff. They're coming in through drones. They used to come in through tennis balls over the fences. Now they're coming in through drones. It's an uphill battle that the prison service is losing. And to some degree, they control. You know, people are locked up for, usually, you know, many prisons are locked up for 20 hours a day. And there is very little purposeful activity now in prison. Okay, I think it's got to be the last question.
Thank you, Lucy. It's absolutely fascinating, an enormous amount to absorb. I wanted to ask you something quite different. The extent to which the board actually have regard to a prisoner's ambition subsequently. I've been involved in the charity for a number of years, and we support prisoners coming to the end of their long sentences. Lifers we provide, we teach them veterinary science, accountancy, those who are not likely to go before the Parole Board, which is not within your ken, if you like, but we would teach them to, if you like, use forklift trucks. And it's we know that those at that particular stage we have a 60% success rate. So only 40% are recidivists because we keep track with them for over 3 years. But I'm more interested about those who are in the long term. And have to come before the board and actually sought efforts to improve themselves, improve their education, improve the subsequent job prospects.
Absolutely. That's a really, really important point, Robert. Thank you for raising that. Absolutely. Vocational training, the involvement of the voluntary sector, charities, is crucial. I mean, our system wouldn't survive without the voluntary sector. You know, absolutely wouldn't. And the vocational training that is available in prison, there is a fair amount. I mean, again, if you listen to Jason, he talks about, he's done a lot of industrial cleaning courses, BICS, and he wants to go and work in industrial cleaning. But there's not enough. And then, you know, we face the perennial problem of employers not wanting to employ somebody who's come out of prison. So the more help they can get through mentoring in the community, through voluntary sector support, you know, the better. That there are some charities that give grants to prisoners coming out of prison to help them start up on their own. And there are good employers, and obviously there's organisation probation provide sort of route maps into employment, so do certain charities, and it's great to hear that, you know, you're involved in one. And those are all the kind of things we're looking for. And if we see a risk management plan that just has probation support, we'll be saying, well, where's, you know, have you thought about referring them to, you know, this charity or another charity, or, you know, how can they be better supported? And again, that's one of the big arguments about open prison, is that there's often better training opportunities, things like forklift truck training, very popular, very common in open prisons, as is kind of quite a lot of other courses. And also people start going out into the community and getting jobs in the community. They start usually with voluntary work and then can move on into getting paid jobs in the community from open prison, but they've still got that safety net of coming back. Open prison is brilliant when it works, but unfortunately, we had this difficulty period of getting people there, but also there being, because of the prison overcrowding problem, they've been packed with people who don't give a monkeys because they're going to be out, their sentence ends in 6 months' time, and they quite often will pick on the vulnerable IPPs or lifers and get them into trouble because, you know, they have nothing to lose, their sentence is finishing. So open prison, and particularly people who are neurodiverse, who need a lot of support around them, it isn't the right place for everyone. But yeah, vocational work and training is and education, you know, is really important. So I think we're going to have to stop.
Well, in my many exchanges of emails with Lucy to get this programme done, she said, oh, you know, there's not really enough time, I'm not sure, should we leave it till the autumn? And I said, no, we're going for it, and I'm very glad we did. I would like to thank both Lucy Campbell and Lucy Itkin for coming tonight. I still had 3 questions up my sleeve, but I shall have to talk to her privately. I'm very pleased that we have gone on beyond 9 o'clock, and it's been worthwhile, and as a token of our very great appreciation, here's to Lucy. Thank you.
I hope I answered your questions as well.
You did. Thank you for everything.